Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you. It is especially a pleasure to welcome our pets here who are actively participating and already have expressed their opinion regarding the importance of memorialization and work with information in the context of transitional justice. Colleagues, we're amidst war, and this war has been ongoing for almost 12 years now. It's been almost 12 years since our society has been faced with unique challenges, and memorializing these challenges in the future, paying respect, and reflecting on what is happening with us now, how it shapes and changes us, is going to take us a few decades at least. That is why our cooperation is very important. And I believe that this panel is an amazing example of cooperation between academia, journalists, the representatives of the public authorities, archives, and a truly active position, because we're living in the era of information. We are living in the context when information is evolving so quickly, when people can share information even if there is no water supply, if there are missile attacks and we have to hide in the basements. But since we have internet connection, we have access to information and we are aware of everything that is happening because of Russian aggression since 2014. Aside from that, memorialization also gives us an opportunity to cope with all these atrocities and focus on the future. And this is one of the elements, important components for transitional justice. Therefore, you can bring the dog with you.
So, just give us a second. We are waiting for you to get back. I'm worried, actually. All right. So it's quite curious, right? I've never had this type of experience before, where, I really don't like you. I really don't like your introduction, so I'll leave, right? Well, it's never happened to me before. Okay, that's all fine. So we are talking about the most important issues that define our future. And then there are some more, right? There are people who are not present here, and those are the people who are living through their childhood, through a unique childhood at best. And after our victory, we won't be able to assure unique circumstances for them to grow through where there will be only unicorns and rainbows. No, because what we will pass down to them will also be the issues of how to overcome the consequences, the legacy of this aggression. So memorialization is one of the most important steps of understanding and perceiving your past for the future generations. So who is going to be talking to us about that today? And it is something that I really, really need to look at through my notes right now, just to make sure that I properly introduce my colleagues. That is Shevchenko Tatiana, the first deputy head of the State Archival Service of Ukraine. The State Archival Service of Ukraine has been actively cooperating with us, with all of the human rights organizations that are dealing with documentation. And we are constantly in touch, and we are developing a joint strategy. Drobovich Anton, who was the person trying to flee the panel, actually. He is the head of the Center for Human Rights and War Memorialization of the Kyiv School of Economics, and the Kyiv School of Economics has recently launched a couple of curricula, a couple of courses. So thank you so much for bringing this topic back to the academia, to the business community. Romanyuk Oksana, my colleague, and also the director of the Institute of Mass Information, the people who are constantly involved in the most important public discussions, and they are the people ensuring the highest journalist and fact-checking standards in those discussions. And of course, last but not least, Yanchuk Yulia, the representative for the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, the deputy director of the Department of Strategic Communication and Promotion of Ukrainian Culture, head of the Department for Popularizing Ukraine in the World. Because this issue is crucial, right? How heavily do we involve this understanding understanding of how we have to be perceived in our international diplomacy, and how much, to which extent, do we involve our own reflection on the Ukrainian situation, how we align that with the global tendencies, and of course, we're extremely interested in the state strategy in the information policy in this field. So, the structure of this panel will be extremely simple. We will start with short intros, 3 minutes each. So just a general answer to this question: how do you see the role of your efforts in our joint system of memorialization and the entire process? What is your role? Share with us some news updates, your stances, Ms. Titana. Greetings, everyone, once again. I will be extremely brief, but I will split my brief introduction into 2 parts. So the first part, let's go back to 2022. Kherson occupation, it's the spring, right? Archive workers are bearing notes, are bearing propaganda letters mailed by the enemy. They are screenshotting enemy Telegram channels. They're documenting the Russians stealing the documents from the Kherson National Archive and how they're destroying those documents as well. So 2024, right? These documents are going through the value expertise, they're being verified, they're being described, and they become a part of the National Archive. And they are now being permanently put in storage on a national level, and they become the pieces of evidence in the criminal proceedings launched by the Security Service of Ukraine, by the Office of the Prosecutor. They become the basis for imposing personal sanctions on the individuals who committed the crimes of looting and mass evacuating those tools of legacy. And in cooperating with the Defense Intelligence, these people are entered into the war sanctions website as people who steal the legacy. And it is due to the documents that were created in occupation. The second part of my brief: understanding the importance of the work, understanding the importance of documenting. The State Archival Service of Ukraine is drafting, and the government is approving, the state strategy on protecting documental legacy as a guarantee of Ukrainian statehood. And this is a very narrow strategy for specifically the archival service, but looking at the name, we can see what the legislator thinks of our role in preserving these documents. So this strategy implements the initiative of creating the Archive of War for Independence. Since 2014, in Ukraine, we have had a unique ecosystem be established, an ecosystem of organizations involved in documentation. And it is our responsibility as the state that ensures the preservation of these testimonies to accumulate as many events as possible of this most documented war in history. Of course, everyone feels like maybe archival work is something that is no longer relevant and is really hard to do. And to overcome all of these obstacles, we understand that we need to have a platform to communicate amongst each other, which is why we have organized and government has approved, we have drafted a doctrine on the Interagency Working Group on Coordination and Preservation of Documentary Evidence of the Events of this War. On December 1st, we are holding the first administrative meeting. I am incredibly grateful for your participation, engagement, and feedback received from both the representatives of the government entities, but also from the representatives of civil society. And our main goal right now is to preserve and to provide access to this database, to make sure that we establish this database as a foundation for transitional justice and providing access to the truth. Tatiana, please do share how much has been lost as a result of aggression. How many archives have been lost? The percentage is low, even though you are being targeted. We are being targeted. There's a lot of evidence of that, but as of 2022, there were 6% of archival funds being lost because the Crimean archives, the Donetsk and Luhansk archives, were not evacuated of the occupied territories. As of right now, when we're talking about all of the occupied territory, it's less than 1%. As compared to everything else, this is a minimal number. Of course, it's worth receiving applause. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for doing this crucial work related to our history. And thank you for modernizing that work and cooperating with new entities using new models. Anton, the floor is yours. So please tell us, how do you see your role in working on memorialization from the viewpoint of education? Thank you. Alexandra, I do apologize for walking around. I had to get two last names of the individuals related to the memorialization case. Yeah, we want to be as accurate as possible. I will mention those people later on. Just keep that in mind. When we're talking about specific steps, well, I wanted to start by saying that it is phenomenal that this discussion is happening in the framework of discussing strategy, right? In the framework that was set by representatives of the Ministry of Justice, because if we look back at the previous strategy, then the traditional justice was mentioned there only once, in paragraph 26. And if we will go back to that today, I will elaborate. However, it is quite obvious that if we respect ourselves and understand what the future will look like, we have to do whatever possible to make sure that the topic of transitional justice becomes a separate paragraph in the next strategy. Because in the previous strategy, I will just remind you all, it was called a strategic goal, and I believe it has to be documented separately, or it has to be an overarching topic mentioned multiple times throughout the strategy in the context of tackling the issue of the lack of social legal protection and redress. It's not enough to mention it once, right? Because the available toolkit that supports transitional justice usually pertains to everything and anything, right? To allow the community to move from a violation of the norm to a establishment of a new norm. So it's great to see that our discussion has a practical outcome that the Ministry of Justice can use designing this strategic document, which I would like to remind you is approved by the decree of the President of Ukraine and becomes this milestone for the executive branches of the government. Going back to my center that I had, I hope that by the end of December, we will finalize the digital version in English and Ukrainian, and by the end of January, we'll finalize the paperback version. It is the version of research on documenting warfare, where we actually introduce a new methodology of defining documenting war crimes, documenting war, analyzing war crimes, and we have analyzed ever since 2014, relying on the best practices from colleagues from the Helsinki Committee of Human Rights. We've analyzed hundreds and hundreds of organizations, including your organization as well. And we've talked to representatives of all organizations, NGOs and GOs, and we've analyzed around 100 different projects. And it is actually phenomenal as a scientist. It is phenomenal to see how much work has been done. However, every instance, right? In the research, we don't really mark each instance separately, but next year we'll see. We'll actually be able to continue this research along specific lines of efforts. But every time I see that a specific organization or a specific documentation project disappeared forever, and it's not being supported anymore, it's not being led anymore, and I'm not only talking about civil society projects, as many people believe. We have ministries that disappeared into the void. We have centers that disappeared into the void, and international mechanisms that were introduced but also disappeared. So in cases like these, and those entities worked on documentation, right, for years, or were designed to work on documentation, and now they no longer exist. And when you look at that, and when you look through the research and these specific names, these footprints that they have left make me feel anxious, right? It makes me, on one hand, feel happy for what has been done so far and how much is still being done, but on the other hand, I do feel anxious. However, to not take any more of your time, I just want to say that we continue our advocacy work in terms of transitional justice, and we also work on evidence-based research and popularizing the different components of this process, including symbolic reparation and memorialization and the role they play in the transitional justice. If we will talk about that in more detail, I will elaborate, but the latest example is as follows. Last week, the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, cooperating with the state service, was the state civil service. They conducted an event for civil servants, and there were more than 250 participants in the event, and we've discussed cases of implementation of transitional justice. And one of the most recent outcomes that we were able to observe was the scheme that I showed them, was the distribution of efforts in terms of specific measures of transitional justice, including the judicial proceedings as a start, and then institutional reforms related to memorialization. And we see this reverse distribution, even though the sociology and people primarily expect that most of the transitional justice events would be related to ensuring criminal accountability and judicial proceedings. However, in reality, it accounted for no more than 5%, right? So no matter how much people discuss the international tribunals and the courts, it still usually accounts for no more than 5%. So usually the more the soft power components are involved in the transitional justice, the more efficient they are. So the 50-70% of all measures related to transitional justice, everything related to symbolic reparations, when we're talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of cases, they related not to criminal justice, but to these soft power tools. Yeah, we will go back to how we see the main stages of memorialization, to how we see the key cornerstone topics of this process. However, I would like to move on to Oksana. Oksana, how do you see your role right now as one of those pillars of ensuring the transitional justice when working with the media, right, on this topic? And does it actually work? Okay, self-governance, that's what I love in Ukrainian, so let's just switch places. I hope you can hear me, you guys. I believe that media have to be officially recognized as an important component of National Memory Archive, because media are the entities primarily documenting Russian war crimes. They are traditional media, right, that are abiding by journalist ethics. They usually verify those cases to a really high degree, to hold it to a really high standard. And we are working with both law enforcement agencies, but many of the proceedings are based on the materials gathered by the journalist. However, there are two caveats there. The first caveat, that is hard for us to influence, even though we are trying to, are the attacks of the Russian war criminals targeting media. Over the course of the fall, 3 journalists were killed and 3 journalists were severely wounded. People have lost limbs. Some of them are still in the coma. And we understand that Russia is doing that on purpose, to prevent documentation of war crimes being committed, to prevent society from accessing that knowledge and being aware. And we know that Russia has started to attack journalists more and more using drones and loitering munitions. And I honestly can't even imagine what's going to happen next year if we will not take measures to more actively counter these attacks. All of the drones that attacked the journalists were equipped with video cameras, And the drone operators knew very well who they were attacking because those are the people holding video cameras in their hands. We are currently opposed to the journalists marking themselves with a press insignia. However, when we start discussing these topics with international organizations, mentioning to them that any type of crews have to be equipped with anti-drone equipment, that they have to have an armed escort, international organizations tell us, oh my god, but then they become combatant. Oh no, but journalists should never have any weapons on them, and the world should know the truth. What I see is that next year we will have 100-kilometer wide zone away from the front line where it will be extremely difficult to work for journalists and to document war crimes. We are currently looking for ways to counter this. We are currently trying to tell our journalists to either wear civilian clothes or wear combat fatigues, which was unimaginable 3 years ago. It is a violation. No way should a journalist wear combat fatigues. However, otherwise, we would never be able to document any of these crimes. So it is imperative for us to have practical means of protection, but it's also imperative for us to discuss this with our partners of how do we ensure the protection of the journalists. We have to place stronger sanctions on Russia, etc. The second caveat that is both easier and harder to influence is the way journalists are treated, the work of media is treated, and the way it is perceived. This has to be perceived as an important element of ensuring the right to the truth, access to the truth, fighting Russia, and supporting our democracy, supporting memorialization efforts, etc. We see this trend in the regions being quite pervasive, where the small media outlets simply cannot counter local self-government bodies that are opposed to the media writing about some aftermath of the shelling. But there are specific parameters where it doesn't jeopardize the national security. There are specific standards they usually uphold. So, for example, there was a shelling that struck a building downtown, and the media decides to cover that after a certain amount of time, whether it's no longer a threat. This is definitely a civilian facility. However, the media outlet is being prevented by the local self-government bodies, by the local police, by local law enforcement agencies. So something so strange is happening where we're losing our memory.
And what people saw, what people felt, Russian war crimes, there are so many instances of crimes documented, but I think there is over 200,000 proceedings, 202,000. And it is just data in the statistics. And I believe that the people are losing the track of what is happening. Therefore, it's very important to protect the freedom of speech, especially when we will have the proper transitional justice system, because it is important for us to not lose our democracy. And the final thing is the propagandists. I would like us to also keep this component in mind. This is a thing that needs to be documented in detail so that we can demonstrate how it is connected to Russian aggression, how they are trying to instigate war, for it not to ever repeat again. Because I can tell that Ukrainians are like people somewhere in the middle of a desert who are trying to shriek at the top of their lungs, but it is very hard to explain to our European partners what imperialism is, why the Russian TV channel called Dozhd, which translates as rain into English, is also the representation of this imperial system. And I believe that we need a very strong, solid discussion about the crime of aggression, of aggressive propaganda, hate speech. And I think that we also need to document that at the part of everything that we are trying to tackle. And I'd like to also briefly mention that currently 119 journalists died in the last 3 years. 26 of our colleagues are now held in Russian captivity. Approximately one-third of them are females, and we know that they are being ill-treated. They are currently held in the penal colony where Victoria Roshina was also held, the journalist who was murdered by the Russians. That is why it is very important to reiterate it. It is very important to exert pressure on Russians so that there would not be someone like Belgium who a week or 2 weeks ago came out and said, no, we need to continue doing business with Russia. All of these crimes that you're documenting, these are your internal problems. In the meantime, we need to keep doing our business, let alone the policy of the United States of America. Thank you. We would like to also give the floor to Yulia. And now we're moving on to the international side of things. So, to what extent can we provide our mobilization policy and component? Well, we have very mysterious mics. It's hard to tell whether they're on or off, but we're going to share whatever that works. So, Yulia, now is the time for your introductory remarks. Yeah, well, each of you had 5 minutes, so Yulia is also going to have 5 minutes for her speech. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to say that documentation and memorialization are the tools that are used today in diplomacy, that are used for future safety. These are not tools of the past, because documentation allows us to obtain verified evidence that cannot be distorted. And memorialization strengthens it with cultural memory that also allows us to counter Russian propaganda and imperial myth. So I would like to emphasize the importance of the role that media plays in documentation of war crimes, because we're talking about audio documentation, video documentation, written documentation, collecting evidence for international courts, for sanctions, and diplomatic pressures rooted on the aggressor state. Memorialization is also dedicated to shaping historically important, morally crucial foundation that will later on lay the groundwork for establishing museums, organizing cultural projects, various memorialization dates, information campaigns. Regarding the role of the ministry in this domain, I'd like to say that there is a strategy for information security, a very comprehensive document, and presently the ministry, together with other stakeholders, has updated the draft strategy. And the objective 4 is dedicated to developing programs for memorialization to preserve historical memory. That is why we're gonna keep working in this area. Also, the ministry is constantly organizing awareness-raising campaigns to disseminate information dedicated to various memorialization dates, the Day of Unity, Memory Day, the Day of the Heroes of the Heavenly Hundred, Constitution Day, Defenders Day, especially dedicated to those who died while defending Ukraine's territorial integrity. And we are organizing various information raising campaigns and awareness campaigns thanks to our colleagues from media, thanks to the state military administrations, thanks to Ukrinform informational agency, Suspilne broadcaster. So this is constantly on the agenda and it is constantly discussed in the information domain. I would like to also say that the ministry is organizing various art competitions. This year, 2 art competitions dedicated to creating videos, dedicated to the heroic deeds of our defenders and veterans. Basically, it is dedicated to filming movies, and 15 projects were pitched in October this year. So the ministry, together with the artists and partners, have presented this project that were selected following the pitch. And last year, 5 documentaries resulted from the same kind of a pitch. It is dedicated to the history of photography development, basically various historical documentaries that are dedicated to the heroism of our defenders. These films were also presented in various European countries, and this kind of effort contributes to convey truth globally. Truthful information, verified information about Ukraine's agency, about the fact that it is not only some temporary fight for independence, that it has been ongoing for centuries. I would like to also say that such art competitions are also organized to publish various books that are aimed at strengthening a union within the country. So books that have been published are also dedicated to history. Aside from that, we also had some competitive selection competitions for awareness-raising campaigns for the residents of occupied and frontline areas. And here we're talking about publishing the newspapers, because in those territories people have problem with internet access, and as a result of that problem with obtaining information. Therefore, the only source for obtaining information are the newspapers. Hence, the decision was made to also do that. And therefore, documentation, memorialization is a very powerful tool that allows us shape narrative, that allows us disseminate this information not only within Ukraine but also outside of it, to strengthen international support and strengthening Ukraine's image globally. And it also serves as a proof that democracy is fighting versus authoritarian violence rather than aggressor state. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we basically heard a short remark from each of our panelists, and now I'm gonna ask one question that I would like to discuss with you, and after that, I will give you a chance to ask your questions. So in the meantime, you have some time to process all of the information. So yes, please be patient now, as I'm going to go first and ask my question. Of course, we all can tell that memorialization is a component of informational effort that allows us to express many things. For example, we want to be respected, we want justice to come, we want to understand what is happening, because this is how our brain perceives safety. But at the same time, we have this traumatic Soviet legacy of memorialization. Let's take an example, memorialization of World War II, when we're organizing this military parades on the days when we actually should be commemorating the memory of the fallen soldiers. So how do you see it? What are the most important tasks in the context of this memorialization policy of the strategy? What should be taken into account, and what solutions should it suggest? Providing the current situation, current mood in the society, and the fact that we are memorializing it as traumatic events are still unfolding, but we cannot postpone it because we need it here and now. So, what are the main obstacles that our strategy should be ready to overcome, provided what is happening in our society? So, who wants to go first? Tatiana? Thank you for this question. But we have the body that is responsible for shaping and framing the policy dedicated to memorialization and memory culture, the Ukraine Institute for National Memory. So, from the ethical viewpoint, well, but what are your recommendations as a practitioner? Well, recommendations. Yeah, we need to overcome the post-Soviet totalitarian legacy, what started in 2014, then what happened in 2022. And it's very difficult to combine all of that together. And this is a task for the Ukraine Institute of National Memory. And according to the new law, they have been assigned a special status. They have lots of responsibilities, but at the same time, they also have to cope with lots of challenges. But I think that memorialization is probably one of the pillars that are so needed for transitional justice. I believe that it all should be coordinated and coherent. And I believe that the human rights strategy cannot cover all the processes that are supposed to happen, that are supposed to take place. Strategy should serve as a framework document, and it is also necessary to develop some additional regulations And with Olena's help, while preparing for today's event, I learned that there is the government assignment that was set to the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Development of Communities, and Ministry for Social Policy regarding developing the measures and the framework for this transitional justice strategy. So yes, it is discussed and it should be a comprehensive solution. Yes, it is true. It should be systematic and comprehensive. It requires this bird's eye view. Anton, I can tell that you're willing to respond to it. You have righteously mentioned that memorialization amidst war. It is true. It is a huge challenge because usually if we are approaching it from theoretical point of view when it comes to memorialization and memory studies, traditionally everything that relies on academic background or history, it requires some distance in time. So if we're talking about any historical disciplines that require oral history method, all of that has always been accompanied by distance, because this distance allows you to approach it in a calmer way. On the other hand, we can tell what these methodological recommendations resulted in. We have outstanding museums, world-class centers, rights defense organizations and hubs that are based on this methodology, academia that rely on this methodology. And for decades, prevention was at the core. We're going to do everything for this to never repeat again. And what do we see? It repeated in the 90s, in the Balkans, in Africa, Latin America, Aleppo, and it keeps repeating itself again and again. And I'm being very humble. I'm just mentioning a few examples. Because, if we look back in a more systemic way, it keeps repeating itself. So this methodological recommendation about this prevention is also being debated and analyzed, because probably distance does not always work the way we expect it to work. Maybe prevention does not work at all, or at least does not work the way we expect it to. This is a very painful statement. I agree, it is a very painful statement, but many people say that maybe it doesn't really work, or maybe it doesn't work the way they expect it to. For example, let's take Yad Vashem, Holocaust Memorial. There are so many great examples. So what? Dozens of millions, hundreds of millions of these memorial paradigms. Did it help residents of Sarajevo who were shot for 3.5 years? 2 hours away by plane from Milan. Did it help Aleppo? All these amazing tourists who visited those places. Did they take it to the streets when Rwanda genocide was happening? This is actually my favorite thing. When the scholars are not studying history, but rather dealing with something very realistic, what is happening now. Everyone is preparing for the past wars, but it is important to prepare for future wars instead. That is true. And if we look at it from the practical viewpoint, because, I have a separate lecture. I just don't want to start. Not now. Maybe lecture sometime later on a different occasion. I'm not going to do that. But, there was a text written by me. But actually, I'm not the only author who was writing it. This is more of a generalization of opinion of various civil society organizations who were memorializing what happened during the anti-terroristic operation and war. Basically, this is a text that tells about at least 10 main challenges. For example, truth. For example, don't memorialize. Don't try making heroic people who did bad deeds, because we also have scaredy cats. We have war criminals who should not be memorialized, because Sometimes you shouldn't memorialize them. You shouldn't commemorate them, or like don't violate other people's rights when you're creating some memorial. Organize all of the necessary selective procedures and whatnot. These 10 principles for memorializing the words, a text that very concretely outlines how we can deal with those challenges. And at least lets us to take the first step. That it has to be emotional, that it has to be timely. These are things that we're going to deal with, and they should be taken into account. Thank you, Anton. Oksana, are you ready? Can Okay, the mic works now. Okay, it has to be true and it has to be public. This is very important for memorialization. And I would like to see bigger support from the state for independent media. Why are we sponsoring TV marathon? A lot of money is spent on it. Well, I understand that, yes, there are some newspapers that were funded, but it is necessary to fund online media. To do it better, it is necessary to also better fund the public broadcaster that broadcasts across entire country, that is very dedicated. And recently, I think just a few weeks back in Dnipro, an entire office burned down entirely. And by the way, we also had the media base there where we were providing the journalists with the bulletproof vest. All of it is gone now. I would like to see better involvement from the state, because if we later start talking about truth, about documentation, there are some journalists in TV Marathon who are working on the front lines, but unfortunately their effort, their work is not gonna be considered to be 100% truth, because we understand that TV Marathon is censored a lot. We all are aware that this is, well, simply put, our propaganda. That is why it is such a pity that we're losing so much information collected by our colleagues. And it could be used by Ukraine in a proper way. Say, for example, you say that, this was demonstrated on TV Marathon. People are going to just brush it off and say, this is just TV Marathon. Even despite the fact that there are some very hardworking colleagues who go to the front lines. And, we need to do something. We need to discard it. It's not bringing that much use. I don't think that there is point in investing funding into that. It's not practically viable. And it's so sad that we're going to continue this TV marathon in the coming year. And a few more aspects. Education, those documentaries that are being produced, very powerful Ukrainian films that are winning Oscars, etc. I would like them to be screened in schools.
It has to be part of the curriculum. I would like for the projects that will be funded by the Ministry of Culture next year to be integrated into the curricula. Those documentaries that are to be supported, and a lot of funds will be allocated for the support of those documentaries. I want them to be high quality films. I want them to be created by independent directors, by Ukrainian producers. Of course, then there are the advocacy efforts that we have to carry on. Yeah, of course, people are skeptical, but we have to carry on. We have to create these exhibitions. We have to mention that there have to be stronger sanctions to be imposed against Russia. I know that we don't see quick results from any of this, but even now, we are exhibiting items in Italy trying to showcase Russian war crimes documented by journalists. Just 2 weeks ago, we've conducted 2 exhibitions in Sweden where we also exhibited what has been filmed by journalists and exhibited journalist work and their products. Of course, we would want to see quick results, I know. But I don't want to say that, but it feels like we'll only see quicker results when our allies will experience all of these atrocities on their own. And I hate to say that. But we have to do our own thing. We have to continue to document war crimes. We have to continue to support independent we have to support independent media and use their products as evidence not only for Ukrainian law enforcement but also for the international community. To support the exhibitions, I want to say that it feels like hygiene, right? When you stop being hygienic, you see that it gets worse, right? And it's the same thing with exhibitions. Because our friends, they need to get updates. They need to continue to be motivated to cooperate with us. So you are doing the right thing by continuing with the exhibitions. Ms. Yulia, I wanted to add something. So the mics are working, right? This mic is working. I wanted to add a little bit about the importance of spreading information, making sure the outreach reaches our international partners, international community. And I want to go back to the strategy of information security. We have goal number 6, which is development of the strategic communication system, which also provides for the raising awareness amongst the international community on the events in Ukraine. We have our own multimedia platform targeting foreign audiences that disseminates information in 6 different foreign languages. So there are different channels, there are multiple online resources, and it is all official information on the events of Ukraine, on the social life of Ukrainians. All that information is being disseminated in 6 languages across almost the entire world, and they're trying to also expand their coverage. Ukrinform also has international platforms that they use to spread information. When it comes to raising awareness amongst Ukrainian population, it is also imperative. What has been mentioned before is to raise the media literacy, is to raise the critical thinking skills. Of course, through screening films in schools, we had events where we had kids meet Ukrainian heroes. So everything and anything that allows us to increase the critical thinking skills amongst children and adults, amongst Ukrainians at large, it is imperative. Thank you. And I would like to remind you all again that we have Doku Days with a Nomad festival that could also be integrated, because for years and years people have been working on disseminating really high quality information. They could be cooperating with us as well, because the Doku Days Film Festival also has the Archive of War, which is one of the largest integration platforms that some of you cooperate with, actually. Our archival entities as well. Colleagues, friends, we have just a couple of minutes left for your interesting questions. Please don't ask boring questions. No, I'm joking. Ask any questions. Any question is important. An unimportant question is the questions that was never asked. Colleagues, if you have questions, please introduce yourselves and say who is the question addressed to. I can see a hand raised over there, and we'll share our mic. One sec. Thank you. Thank you all so much. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce myself, Marta Martaviev, a 4th-year student of the Lviv National University, of Ivan Franko Lviv National University, a legal department. It is a pleasure for me to be here, and I do have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, but I would like to start with a question to Oksana, to Ms. Romaniuk. You've mentioned, talking about independent media, that they need to be funded. That's true, but I would like to hear more of what you think. How do we ensure the independence of these independent media if they are funded by the state? Ooh, Oksana, this is a complicated, loaded question. This is a great question, actually. The government has mechanisms that existed before. Through the Ukrainian Culture Fund, it funded international media, independent media. But in order to launch this mechanism, it needs to be adopted. It needs to have an independent oversight or monitoring council. It needs to have explicitly stated in the guidelines that the government may never define the topics or the statements being produced by that media. So this is the same grant-based mechanisms that exists in European nations. France or Czech Republic, they provide grants or grant funding to the media. Ukraine could do the same thing, ensuring this transparent, independent mechanism. We believe that we would need 3 to 4 months to launch this mechanism, and we wouldn't need any amendments to the current legislation. I think it would be sufficient to just have certain political will to launch this mechanism. However, under the conditions where we have the TV marathon and when political life started to change, and we see a lot of multiple media publications that are paid for by the politicians, and we can see Yulia Tymoshenko, Shulak buying these articles published by the media in the regions. And there's a lot of covert political advertisements also being published. I don't really see in these conditions any political will, and I don't really see any real chances for this political will to majestically appear next year. And so we end up in a situation where the media market is going through a financial crisis, when the state is not ready to implement this grant-based mechanism for the support of independent media. I know that you have created the mechanism through unemployment, which is a good mechanism in a way, but there are certain nuances and caveats to that. Right. And I'm also worried that our European partners are not really that willing to support the human rights actors, the media sector. I apologize that there are partners of ours present in here. However, when USAID funding was lost, the media market lost around $38 to $40 million of funding. Oksana, we've stepped away from memorialization quite far. No. This gap has not been filled by anyone. It's very important. It's imperative for us to understand that independent media are crucial for documenting war crimes, for memorialization. There's no actor right now that would systematically fund them. I'm not talking about like casinos or gambling entities. No, so I suggest each of you find the media you like and donate to them. Yeah, I support that a lot. I think Tatiana has something to add. Yeah, a lot has been said in regards to taking measures to not lose documented information documented by the media. By the European Language Union in the end of November has launched a platform for audio and visual content dedicated to the events that have been taking place in Ukraine since 2022. So international organizations are supporting us. And furthermore, Suspilne is actually a representative of Ukraine in that organization. So I believe we will not lose the evidentiary basis that we have collected so far. And any media in Ukraine can actually send all of the information has been documented by them to this platform for storage and safekeeping. So colleagues, I reassure you, whatever is important will be kept safe. Thank you. This question led us to actually providing our final conclusions, final statements. Yulia, Anton, please think about this one final statement that you would like to share with the audience as a takeaway. Well, about the importance of memorialization, I guess, should be my closing statement, and about the importance of critical thinking, and to make sure that each and every one of us participates in this process as the person carrying this legacy, carrying Ukrainian historical memory. So work on critical thinking and love Ukraine. Thank you. Right. Okay. Does the mic work now? Yeah? Okay. So, a very specific thing I wanted to mention from two separate specific cases. If we look at the global cases, right, of extreme violence, where we were going through our own life as usual and we weren't really interested about hundreds of thousands of people being murdered and massacred en masse somewhere. We're not the first to live through that, and now we're surprised why isn't the world helping us so much. But we were the same in the 90s, right? So the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina I will bring up as much as I can. I don't think they are talked about nearly enough. The case of former Yugoslavia. Please do raise your hands and I will immediately check how empathetic we are. See, these scientists love their practical approach. Please raise your hand if you know who is Ramush Haradinaj. Oh, phenomenal, right? This is the first time ever that we have one person now. And who is Vojislav Šešelj? Okay, 3 people. That's really cool. 3 people, right? We are talking about war criminals who have been found guilty. And it's great that some human rights activists know about them. However, I want to mention it to you explicitly. When we talk about crimes against humanity, the violation of the rules and customs of war, it's very important to mention what has happened to those individuals after they were found guilty or have spent 10 years in prison. Do you know who they came back as? Home, as national heroes. One of them later became a prime minister, and the other one is still a member of the Serbian parliament since 2016. He represents one of the coalition parties. He is a respected member of society. It is that case when we have invested so much in the criminal justice, but have not invested much in the memorialization of the right to the truth. So we see people who went to prison for war crimes and then became national heroes. We should never allow that to happen, ever. And the second case is really, really brief. Please raise your hand if you know what Mostar is. Okay, that's better, right? Yeah, we've been preparing for this. No. I'm actually trolling all of you because if you asked me a year ago, I would just be looking at you with doe eyes, not knowing what you're talking about. But the Mostar case. Mostar is a city where a bridge of 16th century bridge was blown up. It was restored in 2004 and 2005. It was assigned the status of a UNESCO site of international heritage. So talking about memorialization, we have 10 people here who know what Mostar is, but there are billions of people in the world who have no idea about what it is, and they don't really care. However, I've just checked it before sitting on this panel. Mostar is visited by 1 million of tourists every year, and every year 1 million more people learn about the city of Mostar, learn about the bridge being blown up, who blew up the bridge, when did they do it, and even if a person is attentive enough, they will remember the name of the general who ordered to blow up the bridge. So there are chances, right? Why am I mentioning this? 1 million people a year, memorialization, heritage, and somehow maybe it is related to justice, right? Because if we don't tie it all together, then all of these verdicts against the general who actually poisoned himself because he didn't actually accept the Croatian general who was actually accused of blowing up the bridge, and he killed himself with poison because he didn't accept that verdict. People have to remember who he was as a war criminal, but that's how the accountability is related to memorialization. Yeah, of course, and then there are also ways to memorialize each and single person who was killed in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There are 12 books that mention each and every one last and first name of individuals killed in those atrocities. There's the concept of the survival roses, but we can learn from what has been done before. We can come up with new things because we are the most modern hybrid war for the future of humanity, and we have to come up with new things that will be mentioned in all of these upcoming conferences of what Ukraine has done so far. But this will be important for us as well. So let's think on it. Let's imagine how to best memorialize and integrate our own reflections into our future. Thank you all so much. Thank you to my wonderful speakers, and thank you to the audience. So let's put our hands together.